at a crime scene. So, because this is really, kind of the first responder thing. And then I want you to kind of look at some of this, and some of it I'm not going to go through. I'll skip through some slides, but I want you to look at it on the aspect of, I'm going to have to write this. Or if I did have to write it, how would I write it? Because it can be kind of interesting, I guess. So as we kind of look at, physical evidence, and I'm going to go through a couple things here a little more quickly, but there's 4 different types of evidence, or it's categorized 4 ways. And we're going to kind of dissect it a little bit, but there's different types. So when you kind of think about how you're going to write this, just keep it in the back of your head. So we have what's called testimonial evidence, and probably just based on the word, you can tell it's testimony or verbal. So that is evidence. When somebody gives you a statement, that's going to be evidence. So that's why it's important that you write accurately on what somebody told you, on what they said. Okay, then there's documentary evidence. There's what we call demonstrative evidence, and then physical evidence is that evidence that more than likely you as a patrol officer are going to run into the most, and even as a detective. So just real quick, testimonial evidence, that's the information that you get through interviewing or interrogating. So interviewing a witness or interrogating a suspect. So these are all, it's testimonial. So even though more than likely that person is going to have to come to court, you still want to get their statement as accurate as possible. And again, if it's really important, then you can always quote it if they make a certain statement, like an identification or something like that. Documentary evidence are things that are kind of that you can see and you can feel. Or they're documents. So it could be emails, text messages, videotapes, audio recordings, a bad check, or something similar. So these are those documentary type things. So that's a category of evidence. Demonstrative evidence are things that might be put together to show the jury. So it might be a mock-up or a scale model, like your sketch that you might do at a crime scene. That would be kind of demonstrative evidence. Now, they have a lot of computer CAD sketching programs now, so even though your handheld, your little hand sketch doesn't look that great, it's still okay. But they're able to do scale models on computers now to show trajectory and height and different things like that. So here's one that shows the trajectory of bullets and where victims landed, etc. So and they can even animate this so they can show it to the jury. So this is more demonstrative. Okay. And then the most common form that you're going to run into typically is physical evidence. And that's, this is the substance that really helps establish facts of your case. And it are things that can be seen, touched, smelled, or tasted. Now, I've always had a problem with textbooks because they always put tasted in there. I'm not sure what evidence you're going to taste. It's in the olden days, and I'm not that old to say we never did this when I worked narcotics in LA. We never dipped our finger into a little, we would cover some cocaine and they would cut a hole in the package and you'd see a detective stick their pinky in there and then touch it on their tongue. We never did that shit. Okay, so I don't know, but I'm assuming that early on, before they had test kits, maybe they did. And maybe so the tasted part, I'm not really sure. But it's in there because it's one of the senses. So, understand that, your evidence, this physical evidence we're talking about now, it might be at the crime scene or it might be a couple miles away. It could be a rolling gun battle between 2 cars, 2 different rival gangs. It may also be on a person, like a suspect or a victim. So, you have to really kind of look at this and how you're going to write it, etc. It may tie one crime to a different crime. and it may also, provide you possible leads. So just to kind of get your juices flowing and kind of get you thinking. So, and evidence comes in different things, just to kind of give you some pictures. It could be, the bloody handgun. It could be just some blood droplets. It could be a rope that was used as a ligature to strangle someone. It could be a shotgun shell, or it could even be tire tracks. So in your last report that you did for last week, when the burglary, correct me if I'm wrong, the screen was off the window, right? So the thought is that the person would obviously come from the outside to go to the inside. So how many of you looked for footprints below the window on the outside? Just something for you to kind of think about. Would there have been some footprints? Maybe. Who knows? Maybe. Maybe not. But these are all things for you to consider as we start talking about evidence. And then that's that same photo. So a couple of different crime scenes again, but these are things that you might encounter. How would you not only secure this scene as the first officer on scene, and what would you determine to be evidence? This was out in the middle of the desert where they killed a woman and they tried to burn her to cover up the crime. So different scenes have different things that you have to kind of deal with. Sometimes your scenes are in a room, secluded in a bedroom, or in this particular case, it actually went through the whole house, but the person ended up passing away on the bed. And so, again, some of them are kind of disgusting and hard to kind of look at. This person was basically shot almost in the eye from pretty close range. And this is that person right there, just to show you. There was a gunfight in the middle of the street, and you can see some bullet strikes on the car. So the investigator found that there was more than one shot fired, and you can see some other evidence, whether droplets, casings, etc. So kind of all of this stuff are things that you have to think about, how you're going to document it, things that you don't want to miss, etc. So, kind of moving on a little bit, when we talk, we know the little categories of evidence now. Keep in mind that there's a couple of different types of evidence, or even, kind of more dissected categories. There's what we call direct evidence that establishes proof of a fact without any other evidence. It is what it is. And then there's indirect evidence, which merely tends to incriminate someone. And you're probably saying, okay, I don't understand this. So let me give you an example of indirect. So let's say a suspect's footprint is found at a crime scene. Although the footprints don't directly show the suspect actually committed the crime, the prints do place the person at the crime. So it tends to incriminate them, but it doesn't really prove anything yet. That's what indirect evidence does. Direct evidence would be it would actually be factual, and there would be no, you really don't have to think about it. But indirect basically tends to incriminate someone, but it doesn't prove that they did it. Indirect evidence is also called circumstantial, and you've probably heard that phrase before. So that's circumstantial, and that's where you draw that inference from. And, and we talked a little bit about inference before. Like if you pull around the corner and there's someone laying on the ground and you see someone standing over them with a firearm in their hand and the gun was smoking, okay, the inference that you draw from that is they just shot that person. But until you start getting into the evidence and maybe getting some statements, you can't really prove it yet. More than likely it's true, but right now it's just circumstantial. We kind of talked about the inference on the, looking at the fox. The inference is that the fox killed the chicken, but until you really find a witness or some other type of evidence, you may not be able to actually prove it. So those are kind of the differences as you start to think about stuff. Then there's really small evidence that maybe you won't see, but a forensic tech might be able to get. So small evidence could be like hairs or fibers, and this is like trace evidence. Now, a lot of organizations, depending upon their size, they have these forensic tech folks that will come out and they'll process your crime scene for you, and they'll find this stuff for you. And actually, they'll even write the forensic report for you, which is actually kind of cool. So they'll take all the pictures, they'll do the sketch, they'll write the report on how they recovered the evidence, which kind of takes the burden off of you as the first responder to deal with other stuff. But this is just, I just want you to see how deep it can actually go. So, because there is trace evidence, and sometimes you can't see it until maybe it's, you have a black light or some type of lighting device. I'm going to skip past this. There is something out there when it comes to crime scenes known as the CSI effect. And this is basically where people, Hollywood's kind of depicted things a little bit out of what we're not really able to do. There's a lot of technology now, but it's not really as cool as some of the stuff that you might see on the program CSI. And we can't solve a crime. Well, I mean, we can, but typically we don't solve these homicides in 40 minutes. It takes a little bit longer to, write reports and get search warrants and do all the evidence and things like that. So this CSI effect is a kind of a phenomenon that people think that we can do a lot of things, that we really can't. So there is this expectation by the public that kind of thinks, well, how come you haven't solved it yet? It's been 2 days. But a lot of times it's going to take a lot longer for some of these things to kind of play out. So we talked about the CSI effect, so I don't really need to go through too much of that. Part of your investigation, though, is going to kind of demand you using certain type of equipment, especially if you're in a smaller agency. So kind of knowing what you're going to use and knowing what contamination means. So again, when you're at these crime scenes, you're really going to need to understand, how not to contaminate your crime scene, meaning bring things in or spit your sunflower seeds out, on the ground where the victim is lying, where you're going to get DNA, which is going to contaminate things. So these are just things for you to kind of think about. Again, while it's not a report, these are things that you might fill out. So this is a standard, like an evidence bag. And you'll see on here, the case number, the offense, the date collected, the description of what it is. And then they have this thing called chain of possession or chain of custody. And that's important so you can show the court who booked the evidence, who took it to the property room, who maybe checked it out to bring it to court. And it kind of shows a nice chain of possession where people can't think that law enforcement messed with the evidence. So that's really important. So that's why, documenting times and, having good handwriting and stuff, you're going to fill one of these out more than likely. Making sure that you do that, and then making sure that you don't cross-contaminate, meaning put other stuff with other stuff. Here's a great example of what I mean by that. You have bloody shirts, bloody clothes, sneakers, all in the same box, and it's all partially wrapped and falling apart. That's cross-contamination. So what you really wanted to do is you want to book every one of these pieces separate. It's a pain in the butt, but that's how we do it in order to avoid any type of cross-contamination. So that's a great example of what not to do. So think about, how would you book this knife? How would you describe it if you saw it on the ground and you're the officer that's writing the report? And I know that's not real blood, so it's kind of a funky one. It kind of even looks like paint, doesn't it? But how would you describe that? And these are always things that you have to kind of think about. That it has a black handle. That would be something that you want to maybe measure it, but you don't want to touch it because it might have fingerprints. So again, these are all things that you want to, kind of talk about. How would you book this? And you say, well, why do I need to book a cigarette? And how would I describe it? Well, if you look at the end, can everybody see the lipstick? You might be able to get some DNA off that. So that could be really important. So yeah, if it's still lit, you don't want to book it lit because then you don't want to start a fire. So you have to figure out, well, how do I kind of snub that out, but not mess with the part with the DNA, and how am I going to package it, and how am I going to describe that so people understand what it is? So again, just all kinds of things. Same with photographs. So these are all important. Making sure that we keep the integrity of our evidence, that we keep the chain of custody, so people don't think that we messed with evidence. That's really the importance of chain of custody. And here's an example, a couple of different ones. So there's even envelopes that you can put evidence in, and you'll see it's got chain of custody. So people know exactly who touched it, who moved it, who booked it, who processed it, etc. So accuracy does play a real important role. And while these aren't like full-blown crime reports, they are, you're putting your name and information on these. So it is kind of a little report in a sense. As it relates to recognizing evidence, when you're out there at a crime scene, sometimes it's difficult to immediately identify what is true evidence. If you're not sure, I would probably just book it anyway, because you don't have to use it as evidence, but you never know what might be of evidentiary value. So don't, underestimate some of the things that you see. Even a simple pair of glasses that normally sits on a coffee table, you can see the leg there, that would have been up here on the table, if they're on the floor, might indicate something to you. Like maybe it got knocked off the table somehow. Most people don't keep their glasses on the floor. And maybe the person touched the lens. I mean, you never know. So these are all things for you to kind of think about as you start, looking at evidence and, looking for things that are broken or damaged or are in unusual spots that normally shouldn't be there. Same with like, shoelaces, ropes, cords, things like that. Making sure that, if you're at a crime scene and you start to see things that could be used to strangle someone or to tie somebody up. One of the real important things that they teach you in this, without going into too much detail, is if you're going to uncut this from your victim, don't cut the knot. That's really important, because the knot can be used for like motive purposes on how people tie things. So it's important that you cut away from the knot. And I know that seems like, really, can that do that? Well, it can. A lot of serial killers, rapists, robbers, people that tie people up, they do it the exact same way all the time. So it's important that you don't cut through the knot, because the DA is probably going to get a little pissy at that one. And then there's DNA. Always think about DNA. Fingerprints and DNA, they're really important. Even at small scenes like your last report you did, the burglary, looking for fingerprints. People touch things, and some criminals are smart and they wear gloves. Most aren't, and they don't wear gloves. So, just kind of think, I kind of hate to say it like this, don't think like a criminal, but kind of. Start thinking about what, sometimes if they wear a plastic glove, believe it or not, if they pull that glove off and they throw it down on the ground, you might be able to turn it inside out, and you never know. You might be able to get a fingerprint on the inside of a plastic glove. So as funny as it sounds. So fingerprints and DNA, those are things that can provide positive ID. Blood, things like that, not a positive ID, but you can eliminate suspects. If someone's a type O, but the blood was type A, okay, so you can do that. So again, it's really important. We're not going to go through all of the fingerprints, but just know that fingerprints are really important. And then being able to book your evidence, doing your sketch, things like that, using these placards. Again, if you have forensic people, that definitely helps to do that. And there's different types of placards that are out there. And sometimes scenes have a lot of evidence. It's hard to see here, but if you look, let's see, where's my little thing? Like there's a casing here. And that's why they chose to use these little pointers, because they're trying to point here. So when the forensic person takes the picture, they're basically pointing to the evidence. So let me ask you a question. With this scene right here, You've got all these shell casings. When you collect them, how are you going to collect them? Individually. So when you package them, you're actually going to, again, it's a pain. You're not going to take them all and put them all in the same envelope, because then they're going to cross-contaminate, even though they're more than likely fired from the same weapon. But what if they're not? So it's, sometimes you have more than one shooter. You might have 2 or 3. So that's a good job. You're going to put them each in a little baby envelope, and then you can put the little ones in a bigger envelope if you want to keep them all together. But you're going to want to package each one separately. It's a big pain, but that's really the way that you're going to do it. You're going to mark and photograph everything that you collect. Again, hopefully you have a forensic tech to help you, but you're going to want to do that. There's different packaging, without going into great detail, but there are different packaging. There's paper bags that have, and then there's like plastic, and you can see it's still something you're going to have to fill out. And you can see it, right here, chain of possession. So there's that chain of custody. So that's why your notes are really important, that when you collect a piece of evidence, that you make a notation on how you marked the evidence, what you did with it. And if a forensic person does it, then it's on them to go ahead and book it, etc. But if you do it, you're going to have to remember how you marked it, etc. All right, we talked about cross-contamination. Crime scenes, again, packaging evidence. Your burglary case, it wasn't a door kick, but here, this is really good evidence, because believe it or not, certain tools make certain marks. And you can actually match up a tool mark with a tool that you find on a suspect. So here, if you were, you could, if you wanted to, and a good crime scene person would do this, you can measure it, you can photograph it, but what else could you do? What else for evidence? What could you actually unscrew this and take it? You could. So if you really thought, hey, I want to, we've had a series of residential break-ins and blah, 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 you could actually take this and take it to the lab. We talked about dusting for prints, but so these are all important things that you'd want to do at a crime scene. You don't have to if you don't want to. Photographs are good, but you could, because it's small. You're not going to cut the whole door out, but you could just unscrew that and you could take that. And then you could return it later if you needed to. Here's a couple of crime scene folks, just to show you that, larger departments have these folks that are more specialized than the average officer on doing things like this. Keep in mind, physical evidence is subject to chemical change, negligence, meaning you messing it up, accident, like you drive into a crime scene and a shell casing gets stuck in your tire, which has happened. Intentional damage, theft, alterations, bad storage, etc. So all of these are things that you have to kind of think about. And I'm not going to talk about, evidence rooms, but here's a bad example of an evidence room, and there's a good example. That looks like my kid's room when they were growing up. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Talking about bringing evidence to court, the reason that you mark it and you do everything that you did is because chances are, if your case goes to trial, you're going to have to bring that actual piece of evidence into court. And they're going to want to know, they're going to ask you, how do you know that this is what you booked on the day of the crime, etc.? And you're going to have to be able to explain that, because I marked it this way. I put my initials on it. I put it in this type of bag, however you marked it. So you will end up testifying about it. We talked about fingerprints. I'm not going to go into the different types. I just want you to know that there are different types. So at your burglary scene, basically there's latent, which means invisible. There's visible, which means that your finger touched something, like blood or something. And then there's what we call plastic, which means an impression. So when you're looking at scenes, when you dust for prints, this is a latent fingerprint. Usually you pull it up by using black powder. There's different color powders, etc. And you can photograph it, you can lift it, and then you can have it analyzed. You can also leave a fingerprint by touching something like blood. So maybe you have blood on your finger and you touch a smooth surface. It's not going to be latent because it's not invisible. You're going to be able to see it. And that's actually a pretty good fingerprint right there. And then there's also what they call impression prints or plastic prints, where you touch something that has a surface on it where you'll be able to, you'll leave your fingerprint there. So sometimes that happens as well. So, we talk about dusting for prints. There's a lot of things you could look for. And we're not going to talk really too much about dusting for prints, but people touch things. So just keep that in mind when you do your stuff. And lifting fingerprints, etc. You can do these right at your crime scene, or you can have a crime scene tech do it. There's different color powders for different surfaces, which makes sense, right? If you have a black surface and you use black powder, you yourself are not going to be able to see the print. But if you use a different color, you might be able to bring it up. So you might be able to see the print, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of fluorescent orange. I like it. Or yellow or things like that. But depending upon the surface that you're working on, you're going to be able to find these. If you can't, like on paper, we're actually sophisticated enough now where we can use something called anhydrous, and you can spray it on there and you can put it inside of a chamber and it'll bring the fingerprint up. It'll lift it off of paper. So you have a lot of different things to do. Super glue is kind of one that we tend to use a lot, where you can pull a fingerprint off of firearms. And what it does is it kind of raises the little ridges on your fingers where the oils touch the gun right here, and it makes it hard. And then you can actually put powder on it and then lift it, or you can photograph it, either way. But these are all considerations as you're going through and you're working on your crime scenes and things like that. Don't really need to go into digital fingerprints too much. So a lot of information on fingerprints. I just wanted you to know that they're there. Also, don't forget about palm prints or whole hand prints, because typically palm prints can have ridges and loops, and you can see kind of down here where I circled, they are identifiable. The same with feet, the prints on your feet. So, you can actually match those up, believe it or not. Again, just things to consider. And then the funnier one, but it's actually true, you can get lip prints, believe it or not. It's not very often, but these are things that you could actually match. So just kind of an interesting thing. Voice prints, you probably won't find those. But if somebody's maybe leaving threatening phone calls on somebody's cell phone or something similar, then you could actually have a voice analysis done. So again, just kind of a consideration for you to kind of think about. DNA, just kind of know that DNA can be anywhere. If you've never seen DNA before, here's what an actual DNA pattern looks like. Here's kind of an example. If this is your crime scene strip on the left side, and you look down here at 3 different suspects, who do you think the suspect might be? So if you're saying number 2, yeah, you can see how the pattern really does match up. So you would be able to say, hey, the suspect 2, that's my suspect. So DNA is great, and you don't need a lot of it. It used to be in early technology, you needed like the size of a nickel, but now like a pinhead, just a little bit of DNA is enough to really process. And we actually, when we get back in the classroom, we'll be able to do this. This was from one of the, on the Menifee campus, where we actually did a DNA kind of class, and you got to process DNA. So we actually were working on doing DNA, and here's some of the patterns that the students did. So it's pretty cool. So DNA is an important thing. Blood and body fluid, that's important too. There's a real cool thing called luminol. So even though maybe you don't see it, if you spray it, basically luminol kind of activates in the iron in blood. So when it hits that, it'll light up if you put a black light on it. So here you can tell this is great evidence. I mean, you didn't see anything until you put luminol here, but this is all blood that somebody cleaned up. But that's great evidence, but you have to be able to write about it, or on somebody's pants, or footprints or something like that. So again, just things to consider at your larger crime scenes. The same with blood. It's important that you understand, kind of maybe not the trajectory of how it goes, but you can tell how the spatter went. And just so you know, it's not splatter. A lot of people say blood splatter. That's not, it's spatter is kind of the best way. But this is more of a rub mark. You can see the angle on how it kind of spatters out like this, or how it starts to drip down. So you don't have to be an expert, but these are just things for you to kind of keep an eye on. Hair and fibers we talked a little bit about. Always check for footprints or tire tracks. It's important to kind of look. This is a great footprint right here. And you might be able to, check the neighborhood, or, if you end up stopping somebody and filling out a field ID card and you see they have shoes that match the bottom, so you might be able to actually make a case on something like that. So these are all things to kind of keep in mind. And then some more obvious ones, and we're almost done, would be like bite marks. And you're probably wondering, can you actually match bite marks? Well, the answer to that is, if we can match lip prints, then heck yeah, we can match bite marks, because people's teeth are very individual to them. And you can actually have a cast done on somebody's bite mark. And I know it's a horrible photo to look at, but you could actually, take a cast impression from a suspect, and you could match it up to this nasty mark on this young lady's neck. So these are all, again, considerations as we kind of look at things. We talked about tool marks, the importance of things like that. Firearms, same thing. These are called striations, if you don't know, and you can match these up under a microscope, and you can see how they just kind of fit. Here's a great example with the double striation right here, and you can tell if it's the same, if that bullet was fired from the same weapon. So a lot of good stuff. Even gunshot residue, we have the ability to determine if someone fired a firearm recently. So these are, again, all things there. If you ended up at a crime scene and someone says, I don't know what happened, and you think maybe they were the shooter, you could have them submit to a GSR test to determine if in fact they have fired a weapon. Now that doesn't mean that they're guilty, but you can at least show that they have recently fired a weapon, and maybe that'll kind of lead you down the path of getting more information. Let's see. Don't really need to talk too much about drugs in this, or really skeletal remains. I just wanted you. Okay. So I thought it was important that you really kind of see the kind of how technical it can be when it comes to first officer on the scene and all of the stuff that you could be confronted with. So I hope it wasn't too overwhelming, but you need to know that some scenes are simple, and some reports will be simple, kind of like the one that you're looking at here, where it's just going to be maybe a phone follow-up investigation, a supplemental type report, or it could be some big nasty crime scene with 2 or 3 people that have been shot and evidence all over the place. So things do vary. With that being said, actually we're making pretty good time.